I'm going to talk a little bit about working for the World Bank and a little bit about development and inequality. And I'm going to try and weave those together through this presentation in some way and end up with some interesting questions which might get a bit of a debate going, hopefully. So this picture, which I've used as my title screen, is actually a map showing the proportion of people living on less than $1.90 in 2016. I couldn't find a more recent version of this, but it always interests me, this map, just to show the sheer scale of the problem. And one of the things that always surprises me is that South America is less large on this diagram than one might think, given that it's got Brazil in it and that sort of thing. And of course, India is huge and Nigeria is huge. And yeah, so that's an interesting map about inequality. Here's another issue of inequality. This is a graph showing the way that global extreme poverty was tracking before COVID. And these were three projections of the way that global extreme poverty would track following COVID. And basically it's been in a gentle decline for several years, and it looks set to increase this year. It seems unlikely that there will be any version of this that global extreme poverty doesn't increase this year. So I joined the World Bank in 1998, and at the time the World Bank strapline was "Our dream is a world free of poverty." They've developed that strapline a little bit, and it is now the bank's mission to end extreme poverty within a generation and boost shared prosperity. And they try to do all of that sustainably, which can sometimes lead to contradictory paths. But I joined the World Bank. I had spent part of my career prior to that working on a lot of developing country energy and water projects and looking at things like water rights. And it's fairly standard for the World Bank. So I was doing a lot of work in Africa, and although I'd done both electricity and water, I probably had done more water projects than electricity projects. So the World Bank phoned me up and asked me if I'd like to come and work for them to work on projects in South Asia on electricity. And I said, but I know very little about South Asia. I've done about one project in Nepal, one in Pakistan, and that's it. And they said, no, that's fine. But that's pretty standard for the bank. They don't always take what you think might be the logical step, but there we go. So a little bit about the bank in terms of size. 45.9 billion sounds like a lot, but in terms of the development need throughout the world, it's a real drop in the ocean. We have some 12,000 projects, and even I get surprised by that number. It is a really huge amount of projects, and they're spread over 189 member countries. Some of those member countries are donor countries rather than recipient countries. So what did I do? Well, I spent most of my time working on South Asia in electricity and water projects, and that meant that I actually spent some time doing hydropower projects. And the mention of large dams usually causes quite a sharp intake of breath by somebody. But this was one of my last projects at the bank, which was a project in India called Rampur, which is in Himachal Pradesh. And it didn't involve a dam because it reused water from an existing dam and generated 414 megawatts of hydropower. And really interesting project because it was relatively low impact. Although when you look at that picture, you might find it hard to believe that that constitutes low impact because it looks as though somebody's scarred the land somewhat. This I wanted to show you because this is the housing that was built for people who had to move as a result of the project. And it always fascinates me, this particular picture, because that little top floor that somebody's building on the left-hand side of the photograph is where the people who moved into the house below decided to add an additional floor to their new house, which I was delighted by because it just is such a sign of sort of vibrancy that they would make that effort. The other thing is this, which was a health van. It's sort of like a minibus. And the project paid for this minibus to drive around all of the villages around the project. And it provided for a doctor and nurses and medicines, and basically meant that villagers who had pretty much no access to medical facilities suddenly had access. And one of the things the project did, which I really liked, was that it put into place this health van long before the project was in place, long before they even got approval to do the project. They put this health van in place and sent it round to the villages. And so that the villagers could see a real positive impact, a real benefit that they could get from having this project in their midst. So that's the kind of project that I used to do at the World Bank. I used to do an undergrad lecture in engineering on sustainable development, and I used to start with this question about whether it's developing sustainably or sustainable development. And I used to challenge the audience to tell me what the difference is. And I won't challenge you guys without warning, but to me, the difference between developing sustainably and sustainable development is that in developing sustainably, you are actually developing. The problem with sustainable development is if you cannot do it sustainably, what do you do? And this is really brought home to me by the carbon calculations, because for most of the very poorest villages in the world, they are now at their lowest carbon emission trajectory that they will ever be on. Any movement of development that they take beyond what they're currently doing will probably lead to higher carbon emissions. So if you want to try to keep limiting their carbon emissions, you may also be limiting their development. And this cartoon happens to fill up the rest of the slide, but is about the fact that development is a completely cohesive consideration, and you cannot do one bit without considering the rest. And consequently, you can't give computers to a school without them having electricity. The other issue, which is a challenge for development and impact, is prioritization. As I say, that amount of money that the World Bank invests every year is tiny compared to the amount that's needed. And you have to decide what you want. And for the most part, the question is that at the bottom, well, why can't we have it all? Why do we have to choose between having electricity or roads or health or sanitation? And it's a very difficult question to answer. So how do you prioritize? And I think this was one of the most difficult things that I had to learn when working for the World Bank, was that you couldn't do everything. And deciding what to do was very difficult. And very much it has to be the government of the country concerned's decision as to what they do. And you can help them a bit with information, with data, such as poverty mapping. This picture on the front of this book is a poverty map. We can talk a bit more about poverty maps if you'd like to. You can look at that sort of information, you can take advice from experts, but ultimately it's the government's decision, what it is that they want to do. And the problem then is, what if you disagree? What if the government's decision is that they should build a new airport when you feel that their priorities should be health and education? It's very, very difficult, even as a member of the World Bank, to go into the office of a senior government minister or even the Prime Minister and say, oh no, you're wrong, you don't need an airport, you need hospitals. So that's a difficult point, and one which few people think about when they're criticising the World Bank for what projects it does. We also have to be really, really careful about what it is that we're aiming to do. And efficiency is one of those aims you have to be quite careful about. There are definitely more efficient ways to do things which you don't want to do in the first place. So a lot of what I did at the World Bank was trying to bring together the views of stakeholders, which were very much soft subjects. They were about emotion and opinion, values and preferences, and to bring that together with the hard information, facts and science and economic pricing and technical risk, and try to tread a line between those two, which brought them together in some meaningful way. Oh yes, so this is a side comment, and I'm going to ask that if there's one thing that you remember by the end of this presentation, please make it this: that finance and economics are not the same thing. Now this is difficult because in some languages actually the words are very similar, or even the other way around, but it is absolutely essential not to confuse finance and economics. Finance is about the way you pay for a project, and economics is about the development value of that project to the country concerned. And they're two very, very different things. And one of the ways I like to explain why they're so different is that when you're working out how to finance a project, the cost of paying wages to the construction workers is a cost. It's something which you have to find money to pay. From an economic point of view, the wages of the construction workers is an economic benefit. It's not a cost. So these are two very different lenses for looking at projects, and it's really important to keep them separate. And far too many people try to conflate the two. And if somebody ever puts a piece of paper in front of you and tells you it's a finance and economic analysis, then throw them out of the room because they're talking nonsense. Okay, so if you want to do something about infrastructure, where do you start? You may have my picture over top of this picture, but if you're looking at this picture of a very, very overloaded vehicle, is that an issue of failure to license vehicles properly and to maintain vehicles properly? Or is it a question about public transport? Does it imply that there is inadequate public transport? And which should you address? Or should you actually be addressing not addressing the foreground of the picture at all, and addressing the forest degradation which is behind it? So often really difficult questions about where to go with these things. The World Bank has a full suite of environmental and social safeguards, which it applies to every project that it does. And for every project, each of these issues needs to be considered and explained to ensure that the project is as sustainable as we can possibly make it. Some of these things imply trade-offs, which can be difficult. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a minute and see if there are any questions, and then I'll move on to a bit more about poverty and inequality. No? Everybody totally happy? Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question about what you're talking about when collaborating with local communities. How does that interaction normally begin? Like, what is the way that the World Bank kind of engages in those interactions?
Well, we have a sort of a consultative process. Difficulty is that the World Bank have to be asked by a government to get involved in a project. So by the time we're asked by government, the project has, at least in some sense, moved forward. So we never actually get to start from absolutely the beginning of, before anybody's even thought about the project. It's always partly prepared by the time we get to it. And the government may or may not have done some consultation before the World Bank gets involved. But we spend a lot of time going out and doing consultation on the project. Sometimes that is affected by the degree to which the population have already been given the impression that the project is a fait accompli and that nothing they say will make any difference. And that's quite hard because we really actually do want to take account of what they're saying and incorporate it, but they may feel that the government's already made a decision and nothing they say will make a difference. It's quite hard to get over that. But so we tend to organise consultation in a variety of different ways, depending on the context of the particular country. Traditionally, the World Bank has used local non-government organisations to help them with consultation. But one project I was involved in the south of India, I sort of said, so, which NGO are we using? And I was told quite firmly that each individual in Karnataka is their own NGO and they don't need any NGO to speak for them. And it depends where you are. Some countries you find it quite difficult to get to talk to the women, and very easy to get to talk to the men. But we're kind of aware of that and do our best to make sure that perhaps we hold separate women-only meetings. Sometimes the women are happier to talk if there aren't any men present. So yeah, a lot of work needs doing. It does come a point we probably consult kind of a little bit too far on occasions. There does come a point where you've consulted with the local people so much and tried to get their views and incorporate them and all the rest of it. And then the powers that be at the World Bank will say, oh no, you've got to do one more round of consultation. And you get to the point where the villagers say, look, either build it or don't, but don't come and talk to us again. Because they do get sick of it after a while. But it is something we worry about a great deal.
Thank you. No, thanks, yeah, interesting. There was also another question in the chat. Someone saying that they didn't quite get the difference between the finance and economics on the finance and economics slide that you mentioned earlier.
Okay, right, good. Yeah, this just happens to be a little hobby horse of mine because I get tired of even people who think they're quite good at this, conflating the two. Finance is definitely about how you raise the money to pay for a project. So if you're going to build a road, finance is about getting a bank like the World Bank to lend you the money, okay? But economics is about the development impact that it will have on the country concerned to have a new road. So whether it will perhaps make it easier for somebody to get a product to market, which means that local farmers will gain, or whether somebody will lose land because of the new road, which means that particular person will lose. Those are issues of economics, whereas getting money from the World Bank or even from a private bank to pay for the road is an issue of finance. Come back to me and ask more questions if that needs more. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about poverty and inequality. So I would be really interested to know whether you think that if we weren't going through a global pandemic and all other things were equal, would you expect that all development outcomes are improving, even if only a little bit? Are they improving? Now I'm trying to think what you can do in Zoom. Put your hand up or do a thumbs up if you think that development outcomes are generally improving around the world. Now I have to be able to see the people to do that. Okay, so interestingly, okay, so this was a study which was done in 2015, and it looked at the percentage change in the average mark for students in different countries over a period. So, and what the picture on the left says is that students in Zambia, Uganda, Mozambique and Kenya were actually achieving slightly less well by 2007 than they were in 2000. Whereas actually students in Tanzania, Namibia, Malawi were doing a little bit better. In Malawi's case, only a tiny bit better. And the second picture is on household income, and this looks at the impact on household income of if you finished primary school. So basically it's saying that everybody did better in terms of household income if they at least managed to finish primary school. And but some didn't do so well, depending on if they didn't start primary school on time, then they did particularly badly. What surprised me about this was really the left-hand graph, because I would have thought, if you'd asked me to draw this graph, that most of these numbers would have been just positive, even if only a little bit. I'm surprised at the extent of the improvement in Namibia. 10% is a really substantial improvement. But it's interesting that these scores are not all trending in a positive direction. So, and another study looked at this and looked at the difference between a girl living in a rural household in the bottom quartile of wealth and headed by a female head of household, with the female head of household who has 0 years of education, compared to a boy living in an urban area in the top quartile of wealth, headed by a man with more than 10 years of education. So it compared the outcomes for those two types of child. And this is what it found. So the blue are the outcomes for the child A, the rural girl child, and the B are the outcomes for the boys. And it's the differences which are really interesting here. We have Namibia, which achieved one of the best improvements in education over the period of our previous slide. Look at the difference between the rural outcomes and the urban outcomes for Namibia. And, but also look at Malawi, you know, the 2 slides back, Malawi wasn't doing so well. But actually Malawi has narrowed the gap between outcomes for the rural and the urban child quite dramatically. So there's some, I can't produce you a conclusion on this basis, apart from the fact that Madagascar's little rural girl doesn't even manage to get on the slide. Come to that, neither does Mozambique or Niger. But I just thought there are some really interesting points about development which aren't always moving in the direction we'd like to think they were. The other thing I'd like to say something about is climate change and inequality. And there is too often a feeling that everything which is positive for climate change is also has a positive social outcome. And it just isn't necessarily the case. And this, if we were in a more interactive environment, I'd ask if anybody could tell me what this is. But it is a cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And cobalt is needed to produce batteries, which are very often paired up with solar panels and put forward as the ultimate answer to sustainable electricity for all and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay. Conditions in these mines are atrocious. You can see the kind of safety equipment that these people have been issued with. And a recent study found that women in these cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo report having been raped in the past year. 80% of women in those mines have been raped in the past year. And I think that brings the environmental credentials of batteries under some question. The other thing that we need to think about are maybe the unintended consequences of certain projects. This is a picture of a proposed bridge from Mumbai to Navi, Mumbai. And beautiful bridge. It was supposed to have a road and a railway line on this bridge. And unfortunately, the municipality decided quite late on that unfortunately they couldn't afford all of it. And so they decided to make it a road bridge and not a rail bridge. There are some positive impacts of this infrastructure in terms of improved air quality and employment opportunities, but there are also some negative side effects because it's the very poorest people who tend to travel by train, and actually only 8% of the population own a car. So in building a road bridge and then not providing any bus services across it, this infrastructure does not help the poorest sections of the population of Mumbai. And yet I'm sure that that's not, they didn't set out to do that. That wasn't an intention on behalf of the authorities. They were just doing what they thought they could afford. So couple of questions for the end, which I'd really like to talk to you about. One of them is, why do we need development banks? Why can these projects not be funded by ordinary commercial banks? And I've got a couple of thoughts there about why that might be. And the presence of inequality is probably one of those questions. But the other one is, how will we know when we don't need development banks anymore? The World Bank's objectives are to reduce the number of people living on less than $1.90 a day, and also reduce the number of people who earn less than 40% of the average income. Well, there will always be a number of people who earn less than 40% of the average income. So at that rate, the World Bank will never not be needed. So I'd be really interested to discuss any of those points with you.